Storm was born to run. From the moment he took his first steps, everyone knew he was special. His legs were long and powerful, his coat gleamed like polished mahogany under the sun, and his spirit was unbreakable. Trainers whispered about him in excitement, "This one's going to be a champion." And they were right. By the time he was 3, Storm had already won races that most horses only dreamed of. Crowds cheered his name, cameras flashed, and reporters wrote stories about his speed, his strength, his determination. He had everything: fame, trophies, a team of caretakers who admired him. But Storm didn't understand why. After every race, when the cheering stopped and the stable grew quiet, he felt empty. Something was missing. Then, on a stormy night, when the wind howled through the stable doors and rain poured in heavy sheets, everything changed. A tiny sound, a whimper, barely audible over the storm, caught his attention. Outside, near a pile of old hay, a small shape huddled against the cold. A puppy, alone, shivering, soaking wet. Storm didn't know much about dogs, but something in his heart told him this little creature needed him. So, with a careful, gentle nudge of his nose, he pulled the tiny pup closer, sheltering him from the wind. In that moment, under the roar of the storm, something clicked. Storm had spent his whole life running, chasing victory after victory. But for the first time, he wasn't thinking about the next race, the next trophy, or the next finish line. For the first time, he had found something worth standing still for. Storm was no ordinary racehorse. Born on one of the most prestigious thoroughbred farms in Kentucky, he was bred from a long line of champions. His sire had broken records. His dam was known for her endurance and grace. From the moment Storm stood on wobbly legs, his trainers knew he had something special, an energy, a fire, a hunger to run. As a young colt, Storm loved to chase the wind. While the other foals stayed close to their mothers, Storm would bolt across the fields, his hooves pounding against the soft earth like a drumbeat. He was fast. Faster than any other horse in his pasture. Faster than the trainers expected. "He's got the heart of a warrior," one of them had said, watching him with admiration. "This one, he's going places." And they were right. By the time Storm turned 2, he was already training for the big leagues. The track became his second home. He learned the starting gates, the feel of the jockey's weight on his back, the thunderous roar of the crowd as he raced toward the finish line. And he loved it. The rush, the speed, the challenge. Nothing compared to the feeling of pushing himself to the limit, of outrunning the others, of crossing that finish line first. But there was something no one noticed. Storm ran because he had to, because it was all he knew. But when the race was over, when the crowd went home, when the stable doors closed for the night, he was alone. Storm had everything a racehorse could ever dream of: fame, trophies, admiration. But deep inside, something felt off. He didn't understand it. He had never known anything else. He was a champion. He was born to run. And yet, there were moments, quiet moments, when the stable was empty, when he stood in his stall and listened to the night, that he felt a strange, heavy emptiness settle in his chest. Something was missing. He just didn't know what. One evening, as Storm rested in his stall after a long day of training, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the stables, rattling the wooden doors. Rain lashed against the roof, drumming like 1,000 hoofbeats. Lightning split the sky, followed by the deep, growling rumble of thunder. Storm wasn't afraid of storms. He had heard them before, had seen the sky turn dark and wild. But tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a strange energy, something pulling at him, urging him to pay attention. Then, he heard it. A sound so small, so faint, that he almost missed it. A whimper. Storm's ears flicked forward. He turned his head toward the stable door, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Another whimper, high-pitched, weak, barely audible over the storm. Curious, Storm stepped forward. He nudged the door with his nose, pushing it open just enough to see outside. At first, he saw nothing, just darkness, rain, and the muddy ground beyond the stable. But then, his sharp eyes caught movement near a pile of old hay. A small, shivering shape huddled against the cold. It was a puppy, tiny, frail, soaking wet. The little dog's fur was matted with mud, its body trembling violently. Its ears were pressed flat against its head, and its big, scared eyes darted around as if searching for something, someone. Storm didn't know much about dogs. He had seen them before, barking excitedly around the stables, chasing after farmhands. But this one was different. This one was alone. Without thinking, Storm stretched his neck forward and nudged the puppy gently with his nose. The little creature let out a soft yelp, startled by the touch. But when it realized Storm meant no harm, it stopped trembling. Just for a moment. Storm felt something stir in his chest. Something he had never felt before. A strange warmth. A sense of responsibility. A sense of the puppy needed him. Carefully, Storm bent down and used his muzzle to nudge the puppy. The little dog hesitated. Its tiny legs unsteady, but then its tiny legs unsteady. It moved closer. Perhaps sensing safety, stood over it. It moved shielding the pup from the wind and rain. Storm stood over it. The storm raged on outside, but inside, something else was happening. For the first time in his life, something else was thinking about racing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about speed. Storm wasn't thinking about racing, about training schedules. He wasn't thinking about speed. For the first time, winning. He was thinking about training schedules and finish lines. Someone else. For the first time, he was thinking about something else. When the storm finally passed and the morning sun stretched over the horizon, and it felt Storm was still standing in the same place. When the storm finally passed and the morning sun stretched over the horizon, the stable workers had arrived. Storm was still standing. The scene they found was one they would never forget. The little puppy. Storm, by now, champion racehorse, the stable workers, the undefeated legend, and the scene they found was one they would never forget. Scrappy Storm, what on earth? Racehorse, one of the stable undefeated legend, staring protectively over a tiny. Another worker knelt down, checking the puppy over. Poor thing must have been abandoned, staring in disbelief. Probably got lost. Another worker knelt down. The head trainer stepped forward, arms crossed. Poor thing must have been abandoned, and it looks like Storm's already decided he's keeping lost in the storm. He murmured. A small smile. The head trainer stepped forward, arms crossed as he studied the pair, lowering his head. And it looks like Storm's already decided he's keeping him. The little dog was still weak, but no longer shivering. He was safe now, softly, and for the first time along the puppy curled up beside his front hooves. From that day on, the little dog was still weak. Storm was still a racehorse. He was still trained, still ran, for the first time in a long time, victory on the track. So was Storm. But now, when he returned to the stable, everything wasn't alone. The puppy, Storm was still a workers had named Lucky. He still trained, constant companion. Still ran wherever Storm went. Victory on Lucky followed. But when Storm ate, when he returned to the stable, beside him, he wasn't. When Storm slept, the puppy curled up next to the workers had named Lucky. His tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. Wherever Storm raced, when the gates opened and he bolted forward, when Storm ate, muscle stretching, Lucky sat beside him. Lucky would watch from the sidelines. Lucky curled up next to his stall, his tail wagging so fast, his tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. Storm had always been fast. And when Storm raced, he had always been strong. And he bolted forward, he had always been a champion, heart pounding. But now, Lucky for the first time, he had something barking excitedly, his tail wagging so fast it was just a blur. Storm had always been fast. He had always been strong. He had always been a champion. But now, for the first time, he had something more. He had a friend, and that, more than any trophy or ribbon, was the greatest prize he had ever won. Storm and Lucky quickly became the talk of the stable. It wasn't every day that a champion racehorse adopted a tiny stray puppy. The other horses seemed confused at first, watching as Lucky trotted beside Storm, his small paws barely making a sound on the stable floor. The workers laughed, shaking their heads at the unlikely friendship. "They're inseparable," one of the trainers said, watching as Lucky tried to chew on Storm's tail, the little pup playfully tugging at the thick strands of hair. But while their bond grew stronger, life at the track didn't slow down. Storm's next big race was only a few weeks away, and training was getting tougher. His routine was strict: early morning gallops, strength-building exercises, and practice sprints. Every day, the trainers pushed him harder, demanding more speed, more endurance. Storm could handle it. He had always been strong, always met every challenge head-on. But this time, something felt different. Lucky hated seeing Storm leave. Each morning, when the stable doors opened and Storm was led out for training, Lucky would try to follow. His tiny legs scrambled to keep up, his tail wagging with determination. But as soon as Storm was taken to the track, Lucky had to stop, left behind at the stable's edge. At first, he barked loudly, demanding to go with Storm. But the trainers shooed him away, laughing at his tiny protests. "He doesn't understand," one of them chuckled. "He just wants to be with Storm." Lucky eventually stopped barking, but his big, brown eyes watched every race, every sprint, every practice. He sat silently, ears perked, his little body tense. It was like he was trying to understand what Storm was doing, trying to figure out why his best friend had to run so fast, so far, without him. Then came the first real test. Storm was scheduled for a full-speed trial run, a simulation of the real race, complete with a starting gate, a full lap, and the sound of a roaring crowd playing over the speakers. It was the closest thing to an actual competition, and the trainers expected Storm to perform at his best. As Storm was led to the track, Lucky, as usual, tried to follow. But this time, something was different. The trainers were distracted, focused on preparing Storm. The stable doors were slightly open. And Lucky, small, fast, and determined, saw his chance. The little pup darted through the gap, sprinting across the dirt path that led to the track. No one noticed. Not until the starting bell rang. The gates flew open, and Storm surged forward, his powerful legs propelling him across the track. The wind rushed past his ears, the ground blurred beneath him. He was in his element, focused, determined. But then, a blur of brown fur. A tiny figure running onto the track. Lucky. Storm's heart nearly stopped. The little pup, so small against the vastness of the track, had somehow made it past the barriers. And now, he was running straight toward the racing lanes, toward danger. The trainers shouted, waving their arms, trying to stop him. But Lucky wasn't listening. His tiny paws pounded the dirt, his ears flapping, his eyes locked onto Storm. Storm didn't hesitate. Instead of pushing forward, instead of finishing his race, he slowed down. His powerful gallop turned into a steady trot. Then, a full stop. The trainers gasped. The other horses flew past him, unaware of what was happening. But Storm didn't care about the race anymore. He cared about Lucky. The little pup skidded to a stop in front of him, panting, his tail wagging furiously. His eyes shone with excitement, as if he was saying, "I did it. I caught up to you." Storm bent his head down and gave Lucky the gentlest nudge with his nose. Lucky had passed his own test, not a test of speed, not of endurance, but of loyalty. Storm didn't win the trial that day. But in that moment, as he stood on the track with Lucky at his side, he realized something important. Some things were more important than races. Storm and Lucky's bond only grew stronger after that day on the track. Storm no longer rushed out of the stable without looking back. He always took a moment to check on Lucky, as if making sure his tiny friend was safe before training. And Lucky, he never tried to run onto the track again. Instead, he sat patiently at the edge, his eyes never leaving Storm as he sprinted across the dirt. It was as if he finally understood that this was Storm's world, and he had to stay behind. But just when everything seemed perfect, life threw them a test they never saw coming. It started with a simple mistake, one that no one thought much of at first. Storm had been training harder than ever, preparing for the biggest race of the season. The competition was fierce, the pressure even greater. His trainers pushed him to his limits, demanding more speed, more power. One morning, after an intense workout, Storm returned to the stable drenched in sweat, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. Lucky greeted him with excited barks, running circles around his hooves. But Storm barely reacted. His head drooped, his breaths came heavy, and when he walked, there was something off. The trainers noticed it too. "He's limping," one of them said, frowning. They inspected his legs carefully, running their hands over his joints, feeling for any swelling or heat. Then came the diagnosis, one that sent a wave of silence through the stable. A tendon strain. It wasn't the worst injury a racehorse could get, but it was bad enough. Bad enough that Storm was pulled from training. Bad enough that his future in the upcoming race was suddenly uncertain. Lucky didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that Storm wasn't moving like he used to, that the excitement in the stable had faded. Instead of the usual routine, Storm leaving for training and Lucky waiting by the fence, his best friend stayed inside his stall, his leg wrapped in bandages. Storm was frustrated. He didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to run, why the trainers kept shaking their heads whenever they checked his leg. His spirit, once so full of fire, dimmed. He spent hours standing in his stall, staring at the track outside, his ears twitching at the distant sound of hooves pounding against the dirt. Lucky tried everything to cheer him up. He brought little scraps of hay to Storm, dropping them at his hooves like tiny gifts. He nuzzled against Storm's legs, wagging his tail in encouragement. But nothing worked. The hardest part came when Storm's trainers made a difficult decision. "He needs more rest," they said. "We're pulling him from the big race." Storm didn't understand the words, but he felt their weight. The stable that had once buzzed with excitement suddenly felt quiet, almost empty. And then, the unthinkable happened. Without the upcoming race to focus on, Storm was no longer the stable's priority. The owners started discussing his future, and the word no one wanted to hear was whispered among them. Retirement. Storm was only a few years into his career, but an injury, no matter how small, meant risk. And for a racehorse, risk was everything. Lucky sensed the shift immediately. The energy in the stable changed. Storm's stall, once the center of attention, was now just another space. The trainers no longer spoke about his next race. They only talked about whether he should be moved, whether it was time to send him somewhere quieter, away from the track, away from Lucky. Lucky refused to accept it. Every time a trainer passed by, He barked furiously, his small body trembling with determination. He sat outside Storm's stall, guarding it as if to say, "He's not going anywhere." But no matter how fiercely Lucky protested, the decision wasn't in his paws. Storm was losing his place in the racing world, and if he was sent away, there was no guarantee he and Lucky would stay together. For the first time, their friendship faced something bigger than training, bigger than races. A future where they might be forced apart. Storm had spent his whole life running. Speed was what defined him. It was what made him special. But now, stuck in his stall with a bandaged leg and whispers of retirement in the air, he felt like he had lost himself. Lucky refused to leave his side. He curled up near Storm's hooves, his little body pressed close, as if he could somehow shield his best friend from whatever was coming. But no matter how much comfort Lucky tried to bring, Storm's spirit was fading. He no longer flicked his ears excitedly when the other horses left for training. He didn't stretch his legs restlessly, eager to run. He barely even touched his food. The trainers noticed. They had seen injuries before, but this was different. Storm wasn't just healing, he was losing the fire that made him great. "His giving up," one of them murmured. Lucky wasn't having it. One morning, as Storm stood motionless in his stall, staring blankly at the world outside, Lucky decided enough was enough. He disappeared for a few minutes, and when he returned, he had something clamped in his tiny jaws, Storm's old training rope. The moment Lucky placed it at Storm's hooves, he let out a playful bark and tugged at the end, his tail wagging wildly. Storm blinked down at him, confused. Lucky barked again, pulling harder. It was a game, a challenge. For the first time in days, Storm moved. He lowered his head, nudging Lucky gently, but the little pup wasn't backing down. He pulled at the rope with all his strength, his tiny paws digging into the hay-covered ground. And then, finally, Storm reacted. He lifted his hoof and tapped at the rope. It was barely a movement, but it was something. Lucky barked excitedly and pulled again. The next day, he did the same thing. And the next. Each time, Storm responded a little more. First, he nudged the rope. Then, he lifted his hoof higher. Then, one morning, after nearly 2 weeks of standing still, he took an actual step. It wasn't much. His leg was still sore, and his movements were stiff. But he moved. The trainers saw it happen. One of them leaned forward, gripping the stable door. "Did he just?" Another nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, he did." That was all it took. Lucky had reignited something in Storm, and now, the trainers knew they had to build on it. They started slow, short walks, light stretches. They spoke to him gently, encouraging him the same way they had when he was a young colt learning to race. Lucky helped every step of the way. When Storm walked, Lucky trotted beside him, his tiny paws matching the rhythm of Storm's hooves. When Storm hesitated, Lucky nudged him forward. It wasn't easy. Some days were harder than others. Storm still felt pain, still had moments of doubt. But every time he faltered, Lucky was there, full of boundless energy, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Weeks passed, and gradually, Storm's strength returned. His muscles no longer felt stiff. His steps became smoother. And then, one morning, after weeks of slow progress, something amazing happened. Storm trotted. It was a small thing, a brief moment of movement, but it was enough to make the trainers cheer. Lucky yipped and jumped in excitement, running circles around Storm. Storm flicked his ears forward, watching his little friend bounce around. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to run. He wasn't back to full strength yet. The big race was long gone, and his future was still uncertain. But one thing was clear. Storm wasn't finished. Not yet. Storm was stronger now. He could walk without hesitation, trot without stiffness, and even break into a light gallop across the training field. The trainers watched in awe. It was a recovery they hadn't expected. A recovery that, at one point, they weren't even sure was possible. But one question remained. Could Storm race again? It wasn't just about speed. Racing required confidence, endurance, and trust. Storm had been one of the fastest horses on the track, but after his injury, after losing his spirit, would he still have the heart to compete? There was only one way to find out. The team decided to enter Storm in a smaller event, nothing as intense as the championship race he had once trained for, but enough to test his abilities. The stakes weren't as high, but to Storm, it might as well have been the most important race of his life. Lucky knew something big was coming. The energy around the stables had shifted, more focused, more urgent. He stuck close to Storm, watching as the trainers prepared him. The day before the race, Storm was led to the practice track for one final test. The gate clanged open, and for a moment, everything was still. The wind rustled through the trees, the dirt track stretched before him, and Lucky sat on the sidelines, eyes locked on his best friend. Storm took a deep breath. Then he ran. The ground thundered beneath his hooves, the wind rushed past his ears, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself again. It wasn't perfect, his strides weren't as smooth as they once were, and he wasn't the fastest horse on the track, but he was running. Lucky barked excitedly from the sidelines, running along the fence as if urging him forward. And when Storm finally skidded to a stop at the end of the track, he turned to look at his little friend. He had done it. He was ready. Race day arrived with the crisp morning air carrying the scent of freshly turned dirt and hay. The stands weren't packed like they had been for his championship races, but there were still enough people to make the atmosphere electric. Storm stood in his stall, shifting his weight, ears twitching. He wasn't nervous. He was excited. Lucky sat right outside, watching the preparations with bright, eager eyes. He had never seen Storm like this before, so alive, so determined. The call for the race came, and the trainers led Storm to the starting gates. He walked with confidence, muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat. He wasn't the favorite to win, but he didn't care. This wasn't about victory. This was about proving to himself that he still had it. The gates clanged shut. The other horses snorted, pawing at the ground. Storm took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, bang! The gates flew open, and the race began. Storm exploded forward, his hooves kicking up dirt. The world blurred around him, the wind roaring in his ears. For a moment, the old fear crept in, the memory of falling, of pain, of losing everything. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of golden fur. Lucky! The little pup had somehow wiggled through the fence and was running along the edge of the track, barking wildly, tail wagging. Storm's heart pounded. Not from fear, but from something else. Determination. He pushed forward. One horse passed him, then another. But Storm wasn't done. He lengthened his stride, his breath steady, his muscles working in perfect rhythm. The crowd gasped as he surged ahead, his chestnut coat gleaming under the sun. The finish line was close now. He wasn't in first place, but it didn't matter. He had made it this far. He was still standing. With one final burst of energy, Storm crossed the line. He wasn't first. He wasn't even second. But when he slowed to a stop and turned his head, he saw Lucky leaping excitedly, barking as if he had just won the greatest victory of all. And in a way, he had. Storm had done what no one thought possible. He had come back. The race was over. The crowd roared, the announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, and the other horses trotted back toward their trainers. Storm stood near the finish line, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. He could still feel the rhythm of the race in his body, the thunder of hooves, the rush of wind, the moment he pushed himself beyond his doubts. He hadn't won. But as he turned his head, he saw Lucky bounding toward him, tail wagging wildly, tongue hanging out in pure joy. The little pup had no idea about winners or losers. To him, Storm was victorious. Storm lowered his head as Lucky leaped up, placing his tiny paws against the horse's muzzle. It was as if he was saying, "You did it! You're amazing!" And for the first time in a long time, Storm truly believed it. Back at the stables, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't the silence of defeat or the tension of disappointment. It was warm, buzzing with something new. Pride. The stable hands patted Storm's neck, murmuring words of admiration. The trainer, who once feared Storm's career was over, stood with a satisfied smile. "You ran a great race, boy," he said, rubbing Storm's nose. "Doesn't matter where you placed. You proved yourself today." Storm let out a deep, contented breath. It wasn't about the trophies anymore. It wasn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about the journey, about the struggle, the fall, and the climb back up. Lucky sat beside him, his head tilted as if he understood everything. Maybe he did. Storm had found something far more valuable than victory. He had found resilience. He had found purpose. And he had found family. Over the next few weeks, life at the stables returned to normal, but something about Storm had changed. He carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He still trained, still ran, but there was no pressure, no fear. He raced not to prove anything to the world, but because he loved it. Lucky remained his shadow, following him everywhere. They were inseparable. One afternoon, as Storm stood in his paddock, watching the other horses, a young boy approached. He was no older than 10, his small hands clutching the wooden fence as he gazed up at the chestnut stallion in awe. His father, one of the trainers, chuckled. "That's Storm," he told the boy. "Not long ago, we thought he'd never race again. But he didn't give up." The boy's eyes widened. "Really?" The father nodded. "Really?" The boy hesitated, then stretched out his hand. Storm leaned forward, his warm breath tickling the boy's fingers. "Wow," the boy whispered. "He's the strongest horse I've ever seen." Storm blinked slowly, nudging the boy's palm. Strength wasn't just about winning races. It was about perseverance, about standing back up after falling, about facing fears head-on. Lucky barked from below, as if agreeing. Storm had won something much bigger than a race that day. He had won back his spirit, his courage, his love for the track, and most of all, he had won the heart of everyone who had ever doubted him. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't coming in first, it's simply refusing to give up. The sun was setting over the stables, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. The evening breeze carried the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the occasional whinny, and the rhythmic rustling of hay. It was peaceful. It was home. Storm stood in his paddock, his coat gleaming in the fading light. His ears twitched at the sound of tiny paws against the dirt. A moment later, Lucky came running up to him, his tail wagging like a little flag in the wind. Storm lowered his head, nudging the puppy gently. Lucky barked in response, then rolled onto his back, paws in the air, waiting for Storm to playfully nose him. This was their routine now, a quiet understanding between two souls who had saved each other. Storm had changed. He was no longer the same horse who had once feared stepping onto the track, who had doubted himself after every setback. He had found something far greater than just speed or strength. He had found heart. He still ran, still trained, but with a different purpose now. It wasn't about proving himself to anyone. It was about the sheer love of running, of feeling the wind in his manet, of knowing that he had faced his fears and come out stronger. And through it all, Lucky was there, his tiny companion, his greatest supporter. The stable hands often joked that Storm had become more than just a racehorse. He was a guardian, a big brother, maybe even a father to the little pup who had needed him just as much as he had needed Lucky. One evening, the trainer leaned against the fence, watching the two of them. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Funny how things work out, huh?" he said to one of the stable hands. "That horse thought he had lost everything. Turns out, he gained something even better." The stable hand chuckled. "Yeah, a whole lot of heart, and a very noisy little shadow." They watched as Lucky playfully nipped at Storm's tail, and Storm, with infinite patience, let him. The trainer shook his head. "I don't know about you, but I think this is the best version of Storm we've ever seen." And he was right. Storm had won hearts, not just races. He had found his strength again, not through trophies or titles, but through love, trust, and an unexpected friendship. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Storm lifted his head, looking out toward the distant track. Maybe he would race again, maybe he wouldn't. But that didn't matter anymore, because no matter where life took him, he knew one thing for certain: he would never be alone again. Lucky curled up beside his hooves, letting out a soft sigh of contentment. Storm gently nudged him, then turned his gaze toward the horizon. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, Storm was ready for whatever came next.